Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm Joe Newmeyer, creative producer here at the Sarasota Film Festival, and thank you for coming. Rory Kennedy is an Oscar-nominated and Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker whose curiosity, sense of history and social justice, and wide sphere of topics have been on view in films about the struggles of an Appalachian family, the world AIDS crisis, the dangers of a nuclear power plant, the Vietnam War, surfing, and now, above and beyond, NASA's Journey to Tomorrow, the U.S. space program. Ladies and gentlemen, Rory Kennedy. Welcome, Rory. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon.
And bringing your amazing film, which is going to be tonight's closing night film. Before we get to that, though, so many topics to talk about, so many terrific films. Let's talk about your interest in documentary films as an art form, as an instrument for social change. When did you first get interested in it, and what was the kind of the model for it? What filmmakers did you look at? What films did you see that kind of inspired you?
Right. Well, I actually started making documentaries pretty soon after I graduated from college. I went to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and I was a women's studies major. There were a lot of questions as to what kind of career I was going to get as a women's studies major at Brown, and I had done my final paper on the difficulties that women addicts have trying to get drug and alcohol treatment, particularly pregnant women and women with children. And while I was doing the research for that paper and writing that paper, I had an opportunity to meet a lot of the women. And some of you might recall, but at that time, there was a lot of press attention and stories in the media about crack mothers having crack babies. And as a result of that, there was, because there was so much anger over these moms, there was a tendency to incarcerate the women for delivering drugs to a minor through the umbilical cord and for child abuse and neglect. And what I was finding in my research is that a lot of these women had actually tried to get drug and alcohol treatment, but had been denied care because a lot of the programs wouldn't accept pregnant women or women with children. The moms had to choose between keeping their children or having social services take them away and dealing with their sobriety. So it was much more complicated than what I was seeing in the press, and I felt that these women were so compelling when I was able to interview them and understand their stories, and that their side of the story wasn't really being presented in the press, and therefore the policies that were being created weren't really in line with what was actually happening. And so I felt like I couldn't bring all of these women to Capitol Hill to meet the legislators who were creating this policy, but I could bring a camera into their living rooms and document their story, and I could bring that film to Capitol Hill, which is what I did. So I made my first film, which was called Women of Substance, and I produced and directed that, and I partnered with a woman named Robin Smith, who really became my mentor because I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I had never taken a film class in my life. So to answer your question, it wasn't like from a very young age, at 4 years old, I, aspired to be a documentary filmmaker. I had never taken a film class. I certainly watched documentaries and I loved them, but I hadn't imagined myself being a documentary filmmaker until then. I started making a documentary, and I really loved every part of the process, from the research to the interviews to the editing and crafting the story, to having it come out in the world and kind of seeing the reaction and the impact that it could have. So I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, and doing it beautifully. The one of the things, just on that note, that I always feel about with documentaries is obviously the research that goes into it. It's a journalistic process, but it is such a visceral experience, and it can really, for audiences and for filmmakers even, the sense that you can bring somebody into an era, into an issue, into a place or time that they maybe don't know about. It's an extraordinary tool that I think is unique and one of a kind. Do you agree?
I do, and I think that's, part of the appeal, right? I mean, and I think that, for so many of us, we don't get to go out in the world and you don't get to experience all these things. And so I think it's an opportunity to expose, audiences that otherwise wouldn't have access to some of these stories. And my feeling about them is that they can really both open our minds and our hearts, right? I mean, for example, I made a film about the global AIDS crisis. One of the characters was a woman from Thailand who was a prostitute. And, having this story that is probably so foreign to so many people in this country, and by the end of the film, having empathy and understanding why she ended up making those choices and what the implications of those choices are and what her world was, I think it can open our hearts and help us connect to the humanity in all of us, right? Even however foreign it is. And similarly, I made a film called Ghost of Abu Ghraib about the images that came out of Abu Ghraib, and part of the storytelling in that is understanding the perspective of all of the players involved, from the prisoners at Abu Ghraib to the prison guards who, had these, took the photographs and put the prisoners in that position. And it's not, it's not an exercise in trying to excuse that behavior, and certainly it's a horrendous behavior, but I think by the end of the film, you understand why it happened and how these people could have done that, and kind of what it is about human nature that leads to those steps, which I didn't understand when I first saw those images. So, it was a process for me in understanding that, and I think it's important to, connect on that human level, and I think documentaries can really, bridge these very far distances between our own experiences and other people's, and help us understand different perspectives, which is what we do every day as we're interacting with our children and our spouses and family members and people who are much closer to us. I mean, it's still an exercise in empathy life.
Right. In fact, Roger Ebert famously called movies the empathy machines, that you can actually kind of empathize with other people in a way that you're not able to in other art forms. And the foreignness that you mentioned is a perfect place to start with American Hollow, your 1999 film, because in that sense, the foreignness turns it into a view of a shadow America in a lot of ways. It was made in 1999, an interesting time to look at a side of America that a lot of America not only didn't want to look at or didn't know about, but it was the golden time in the economy. It's a certain specific kind of bubble that's going on. What was it like looking at that situation in 1999 in Appalachia?
Yeah, so this was about a family of 13. The mother and father had 13 children, all of whom had moved out but had subsequently come back and lived within maybe a mile or two of the parents, except for one who was in Cincinnati. But all of the other kids lived there, and they were way up in the hollow of eastern Kentucky. It was all dirt roads, about 45 minutes to an hour to the closest town, which was Saul, Kentucky, which was maybe a town of 1,500 people or something. So very remote. Very poor. The family very much lived off the land. They had a garden. The boys would go up into the woods and collect bloodroot and ginseng and moss, and they would sell it for money. They had a garden. They had some chickens that they lived off of, and it was really a profile of a family that was quite remote. Despite the poverty, many of the houses that they lived in, some of them didn't have electricity, many of them didn't have bathrooms, so they had outhouses that they would, use that were not connected to the house. And yet they had these, and this was basically before the internet really existed in the way that we see it now, but they had these huge satellite TV dishes outside of their homes, despite that poverty. So you could kind of see how technology and the modern world was kind of entering into this very remote, poor area and understanding what the impact that those kind of contradictory worlds were having on each other. So I was kind of curious about that. I spent about a year on and off living with this family, with my director of photography, Nick Dube, and so the two of us would go down there and film with them. And I think it was an interesting profile. It ended up that film premiered at Sundance. It was my first feature film and had a theatrical release and sort of went off and had a nice life and then was broadcast on HBO. But it was an interesting exercise in storytelling for me because up until that point I had really done issue-oriented films. So I had done Women of Substance, and then I had done this film about AIDS and the global AIDS crisis and needle exchange programs here in this country. And this was sort of the first time that I had really gone into a film with the idea of just verite storytelling and not really knowing where the story was going to lead me. And I love the process of making that film and telling that story and sharing it. And I think, now looking back on it, that is an area that is obviously in the news in this administration because there were a lot of the people who are supporters of Trump and the people who at one point supported Democrats and are now kind of leaning more right, and understanding how we as a nation have really neglected that group was sort of where I was coming from on some level in making this film. And I think there's a greater realization and appreciation now of the neglect of people in that region. And I was actually recently in touch with the family, and my sense was, as Neil Bowling said when I spoke to him, life goes on, but nothing changes here in the Hollow. So there was, so I think it hasn't changed too much, except that they do now all have computers and the internet.
Well, that film, just like what one we'll talk about a little bit later, The Fence, is an example of being a little bit ahead of, in some ways, what will become a national conversation. But I'd like to get back to Pandemic Facing AIDS, which premiered at the International AIDS Conference in Barcelona in 2002 and was also later shown on HBO, and takes a look, as you mentioned, at AIDS outside of the U.S. Was there any kind of conflict, or was there any dealing with international communities and dealing with international governments, organizations in telling that story? What were some of the challenges that you faced in making sure that story got to the screen?
Yeah. So I had actually been asked, the reason that film came about is I had been asked by the AIDS czar under the Clinton administration to join a White House delegation that was going to Africa to look at the AIDS crisis, and particularly focusing on women and children and how they were being impacted by AIDS. And I was asked to do a 15-minute film that we could bring back and show on Capitol Hill. So I joined that delegation, and it was really an amazing experience and again, it was actually just me and Nick Dube. And at that time, I would do the sound and he would do the camera, and I was also directing. But it was, we had a very tight crew. And it was kind of a verite style of filmmaking that we were engaged in. But I remember we went to 3 different countries in Africa, and one of the countries we went to was Uganda. And I remember meeting this woman, Bernadette, who had she had 11 or 12 children. I think she had 12 children, 11 of whom had died of AIDS. And she was the sole caretaker of 35 grandchildren, many of whom themselves were HIV positive or had AIDS, and they all lived together in this hut. It was like a 2-room hut. It was really extraordinary, and I was so overwhelmed by this woman's story and the loss that she had experienced. And I remember thinking the people who organized this delegation must have tried to find the worst case in all of Africa to just sort of kind of jolt us into empathy or understanding the needs there. But I ended up staying behind with this one because I wanted to continue to film with her as the delegation moved on. And she then introduced me to her neighbor who had 7 children, all of whom had died of AIDS. And there was another neighbor who had 8 children, 6 of whom had died of AIDS. And there was really a sense that, this disease was annihilating people and communities and just huge numbers. And we filmed there in Zambia and in South Africa, and came back and made this 15-minute film, which we had the opportunity to then show on Capitol Hill. We had a screening there, which was attended by about 15 senators and members of Congress, and then I had a private screening of the film with 52 senators. And I remember after that screening talking to Senator Leahy of Vermont, and him saying to me, I put an extra $25 million in the budget. At this point, we had just like thousands of dollars that we were committing to this issue. I mean, it was a pittance. So that amount was a huge amount. And he said, I advocated this for the budget because of your film. And, and I had no idea of what was going on before seeing that. And I tell that story because I think it does speak, you don't always, it's very hard to kind of capture the impact that these documentaries have over time, because you make them, you show them to an audience, and then the audience leaves, and some of them might change their careers as a result, and some of them might, change write a check, and you just don't know, and it's hard to document. But so, I think that's testimony to the power of film. But to get back to your question, after making that film, I became aware of how widespread AIDS was around the world, and Africa was certainly the worst, but we were seeing very scary numbers starting to emerge in Eastern Europe, in South America, in the Caribbean, in other places around the world, and I felt that, I had a deep now understanding of what was going on in Africa, or some sort of understanding of it, and I felt we should really learn from that lesson and try to help people prevent the spread of AIDS, because it's so much more strategic and humane to stop it before it gets to the level that it was in Africa, which, once it's at that level, it's very hard to deal with and treat and whatnot. So I went off to develop a 5-part series about the global AIDS crisis, and I got financing from the Gates administration and from HBO, and so they got behind it, and then I set off to make a 5-part series. I didn't find a lot of resistance from the various countries we filmed in. I filmed in Thailand, Brazil, Russia, India, and Uganda. And then I decided, because it was sort of overwhelming to think about how you make a film about the global AIDS crisis, but I decided to, thinking back on my experience in Africa, that I knew these numbers and the statistics coming out of Africa, which were really horrendous, but despite the huge numbers, what stuck with me was Bernadette, right? Was the individuals, was those single stories. And so what I decided is to tell one story in each of the countries, and to focus on that, and then through those stories kind of tell a larger truth, I hoped. So that's sort of how I approached that film, and we ended up making it. It went on HBO, and it went out internationally, and we did a photography exhibit that opened at the Barcelona AIDS conference that Bill Clinton hosted for us, and we did screenings of that on Capitol Hill as well. And I hope and like to think that project had an impact on helping us understand what was going on. I think there's much greater awareness now of what's happening around the world, but in Africa specifically as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up a point that's interesting that relates then to the next one I'd like to talk about, A Boy's Life, which is the telescoping of an issue and kind of finding a subject to kind of tell a story through. And like American Appalachian, it's a story that kind of talks about economic disparity and talks about economic hardship and the ramifications of that. I'm wondering how you found the young boy who's at the center of it, the troubled young man who's there, and how that story came about, how that film, A Boy's Life, came about.
Yeah, so this was a story we filmed in Mississippi, and it was a film that premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. it was, well, I was really looking to do a film. At that time, there had been some changes in the social services that we were providing in the United States, and the Clinton administration was proposing cutting social services for mental illness for children and various people around the country. And so I felt that, people needed to understand the implications of that. So I was looking to profile stories of kids who were being turned off the rolls, and who, clearly had some needs. And so I had heard about this child in Mississippi who had, at the age of 7, had tried to commit suicide. He had killed 4 dogs and 3 cats, and, was really suffering, and that the social services was threatening to cut him off. And so I wanted to learn more about his story, and I ended up spending time with him. And his life story was very complicated. He had lived with his mother, and she had been raped and had this child as a result of that rape. And so the mother had very mixed emotions about the child, and so that was a complicated relationship. The grandmother lived next door. And when we started spending time with the kid, Robert was his name. He was living with his grandmother, and the grandmother had really come in to save the day and intervened, and was clearly the hero of the story as she told it. And it took us a while to get into the school, and the grandmother would tell us all these horrible stories about him and how he tried to commit suicide, and all these stories about him killing these animals and whatnot. And the mother, meanwhile, was sort of struggling down the street, and he did have a therapist, but that was going to be cut off. Eventually, we got into the school, and when we were with him at home, he'd be like hitting his head against the wall, and he was really kind of out of control. But then finally, we got into the school, which took some time. And he was like, he'd sit at his desk and he would raise his hand, and he was an A student, and he was incredibly well behaved. And then it started sort of getting a little complicated and sort of curious, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. Anyway, to make a long story short, it sort of ended up that the grandmother seemed to have an illness where she was convincing this kid that he was mentally ill. And he wasn't actually mentally ill. Wow. And that, when I would say to him, well, Robert, do you remember killing the 4 cats and the 3 dogs? He'd say, no, but my grandmother told me how I did it, and, that I did it in my sleep, and I did it. And so it became this very bizarre film about this family. And the grandmother, we sort of diagnosed her with Munchausen by proxy, which is sort of very complicated and usually has to do with physical illnesses that you create in yourself to sort of need to go to the hospital, but then you can do it by proxy by creating it with other people. But she was doing it with mental illness, and so it was all very bizarre. But it's I think an important film and a fascinating film because it speaks to the complexity of these social service people coming in, and they have 15 minutes to analyze a family dynamic and a situation. And my read of it was at the beginning very different than what it was after spending a year with his family, right? And it took us some time to kind of get to the bottom of it. And so it was very different film that we ended up with than the film that I had imagined making. But, this is the kind of brilliance of documentaries. And I think if you're open enough to kind of continue to see things as they unfold as a filmmaker and not go in with sort of rigid ideas of what you want it to be, that really fascinating stories can emerge. So that is an example of an experience like that for sure.
Yeah, and you have such a rich tapestry of topics. Your next film after that was Indian Point, Imagining the Unimaginable, which was about the Indian Point Energy Center 30 miles north of New York, and which in many ways feels even more relevant today because we now know how susceptible we are to infrastructure and computer network, hacking and everything like that. What did you learn about that scenario that was probably chilling at the time and probably even more chilling now, and that surprised you back for that film?
Yeah, well, I mean, I just think that those nuclear power plants, I mean, this one is, 28 miles, I think, north of New York City and in the center of a population of like 50 million people within a radius of, 20 or so miles. So if something were to happen at that particular nuclear reactor plant, it would impact a huge number of people, a much bigger population than, say, Chernobyl, right? So and then looking at in the aftermath of 9/11, which, when that was created and so many of the nuclear power plants in this country were created, it was pre-9/11 where we weren't even thinking about some sort of potential terrorist activity. And so kind of looking at the landscape of our country and where we're most vulnerable, I felt like that's pretty vulnerable, and understanding all of the ways that, a terrorist group could come in and attack that nuclear power plant, and how we as a country need to kind of rethink where these places are situated and how vulnerable we are was kind of the mission of that. And there were certainly, I mean, there's so many ways that you could get in. I mean, it's not a military zone. It's not protected by the military. It's vulnerable by air. It's vulnerable by boat. It's vulnerable by foot. There's, even though our larger airports are largely protected, arguably that. There's airports in Long Island that are private airports that you don't need to go through security. You could get on a plane and crash it into the nuclear power plant, and that would be that, right? Yeah. So it was, helping us as a country to understand those vulnerabilities and the decisions that we had made and things that we might need to rethink as a result of the new challenges we were facing. Yeah,
it shines an amazing light on it. In Street Fight from 2005 then gets down to onto the roots level of the 2002 mayoral campaign with now Senator Cory Booker back in when he was running for the mayor of Newark, and watching Booker and his generation of Democratic leaders. What struck you about at that time the 2002 campaign that he was in, about the grassroots political campaigns in the modern era? What struck you about those?
Well, that was a fascinating campaign, and I, that of all the films you've mentioned, that one I executive produced, and so I'm going to give credit to Marshall Curry, who was the director of that film, and he brought. He had started documenting and started following that campaign, and then brought the footage to myself and my partner Liz Garbus, and we all lived in Brooklyn, and Marshall actually went to school with my husband, and so we sort of were connected that way. But the footage was amazing. I mean, it was two African American leaders who were going up against each other, and there was some nasty politics being played out, particularly by the sitting mayor that Cory Booker was up against, and it was, it was a fascinating. I mean, I think one of the things that I've found as a filmmaker is kind of the more narrow the story is, the more interesting it is, right? So this was really about these two individuals, but in focusing on their stories and their conflicts with each other, it kind of spoke to much larger truths about what was going on in politics in this country, how politics plays itself out, race relations play themselves out, how power plays itself out, and good old-fashioned dirty politics, right? Yeah. So you see it manifesting on a very personal level on the streets of Newark, New Jersey, in this incredible and intense race. And I'm happy, Cory unfortunately did ultimately lose that mayoral race, but he's now emerged as one of our great leaders, and I do think that the film helped contribute in the early days of his career to understanding, you know, to appreciating him on a national stage. That film did get nominated for an Academy Award. I think it was up against March Against the Penguins, so we didn't have a lot of hope for it. I think our motto was "Penguins taste like chicken" for our campaign, but that didn't quite do the trick.
Well, then in 2007, you had already mentioned Ghosts of Abu Ghraib, but let's talk more about it, because one of the striking things about that film is its view of the psychology of the men and women who were there and what was going on in it. The psychological perspective, how complex it is, especially back in those early days of our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. As you explored the topic, what surprised you about that? Because there was sort of, I'm sure, so much to go into, and I'm positive some things that surprised you, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I was really looking to tell the story from the perspective of the people who had engaged in the activities, and to try as much as possible to have it be firsthand accounts. So it's almost exclusively told by and from people who were at Abu Ghraib at the time the events took place. So we interviewed a number of the guards who were there, maybe 7 or 8 of the guards, and then I think 4 of the prisoners who were there. And then we also interviewed people who were involved in the Bush administration and other legal teams who were involved in the policies that were created at the federal level that ultimately trickled down and enabled what happened at Abu Ghraib to in fact happen. Yeah. And so, you know, I think that the film tries to help portray this story from all of those various perspectives, and I think gives credence to those perspectives. Ultimately, I think it's a pretty damning narrative about the administration and the role they had played in creating the policies that ultimately enabled what happened there to be pretty much par for the course. Yeah. And so I think that the story of kind of these animals on the night shift had emerged because the administration was really they had the microphone and they were able to have that narrative come out, and a lot of the prison guards ended up serving time. But what hadn't emerged to the degree that I felt like it was relevant and important to understanding what actually happened was the role the administration played. And, you know, I mean, I go back often to what a documentary is, and, you know, that idea of kind of the document, right, the original document, and the power of this form to capture that, and be that ultimately, right? Because I wanted the film to be something that somebody could look at 30 years from now and have it feel like it was, you know, the original testimonies, and that it was authentically from the perspective of the people who were there, and so that would be preserved. But in so doing, to also capture the documents that kind of led to this. And so we use, you know, the administration's handwriting and what they said in speeches and in legal documents to create, you know, the case that this was really something that the administration was responsible for.
Did the administration or the State Department get back to have interactions with you afterwards, and kind of did they get blowback from them? No,
they didn't. They really didn't respond to it, and I think part of that was that there was, you know, it was foolproof. I mean, there was nothing in there. Yeah. There was nothing in there that they could argue against, because it was all firsthand documents. Right.
That's interesting. In 2010, you made The Fence, which detailed the border fence between the U.S. and Mexico, and which, of course, has now become a daily idea in American politics. But back then, I'm wondering, looking at that issue like that, could you see, you know, not ways in the future, no one could be that prescient, but the sense of the kind of hot button issue it was to become?
I didn't really anticipate that. I didn't anticipate Trump.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, right. Who could? Right.
So, I didn't see that coming, but it was really a film at the time. It was an issue that wasn't getting much attention, but that was there was such an absurdity to it and the way we were building it and kind of what it represented. And I think it was also, to me, a moment of kind of defining who we are, or potentially, are we a nation that builds walls, or are we Mr. Gorbachev, take down that wall nation? Like, who are we, and how do we want to define ourselves? And so I thought it was a metaphor for something larger that we needed to tackle, and then in the ways that it was, and then what it's, it was the confluence of a number of issues that we were tackling. It was after 9/11, so how do we deal with terrorism? And it was the drug war, and kind of how do we handle the war on drugs overall, and then it's issues around immigration, of course, right? And how do we define ourselves, and how do we handle the influx of immigrants coming into our country? So, and at the same time, the way that the wall was built was so ridiculous. I mean, it was, I think 780 miles on a 2,000-mile border. And so, the first scene of the film is me talking to some of the Minutemen who were early advocates for the fence, and I'm with them at the fence and talking to them, and I say, well, are people able to penetrate the fence or get over the fence? And they said, well, yeah, you can look over there and there's a tunnel, and so they built a tunnel underneath the fence, and then down the road over there they have a ladder that just goes up the fence, and they climb to the top of the fence and they jump down with a rope. And then he said, or you could just go a half a mile down there and the fence just ends, and then we pan over and it just ends. So it's, what are you doing with our tax dollars? Is this like a gesture for votes, or is this something that it was so ridiculous. So part of it was also holding our legislators, both on the left and the right, accountable for doing something that just seemed to be a gesture and folly, and not for any real reason.
Right. Well, and echoes of it now. In 2011, your film Ethel was about your extraordinary mother, Ethel Kennedy. What was it like talking to your siblings, talking to your relatives? Did you almost have to divide yourself into two people? One being the filmmaker, the one who's sort of researching your mother's life, and one being the daughter and sibling and cousin and relative and family member. Did it kind of require almost a kind of a bifurcated approach in some ways?
I'm not sure I would say that. I mean, that film came about, really, it was the brainchild of Sheila Nevins, who, as you know, ran the documentary division at HBO for probably 30 years, and I think most would argue, including me, that she's had more influence on documentaries over the last few decades than any single individual. Certainly in that period of time, and so she's really a legend and an extraordinary person. But so I had made a number of the films that we've talked about today, including the AIDS film American Hollow, A Boy's Life, The Fence, meant almost exclusively for HBO, and so she over those years had met my mother. And we had actually traveled to Cuba together, and my mother had come to Sundance a number of times, and they'd interacted, and I think they were somewhat like-minded in many ways, different in others. But so she was advocating for me to do a documentary about my mother, and I was very resistant, not because I think my mother isn't deserving, but because I think as a family we were, encouraged from a young age to really by example to look outward and to remind people of the needs of others, and that we were pretty well off, and had a lot to be grateful for, and there were a lot of people out there that who were forgotten, and that, not that we were told we needed to do that, but that we were surrounded by people who'd committed themselves to that venture, and it was certainly a source of inspiration, I think, for most of us. And so that's how I grew up, and that's how I processed, I think, issues and sort of my commitment and my time. And so I kept saying no. I'm not doing a documentary about my mother, and Sheila kept saying yes. And so then I said, fine, Sheila, I'll ask my mother, because I knew she would say no. She hates doing interviews. She hates talking about herself as much as I hate talking about myself or, our family or anything. And so I said to my mother, HBO wants to do a documentary about you and wants me to make it. Do you want to do that? And she said, sure. And I said, what? Are you serious? So then I sort of had to wrap my, head around actually making that film, and I decided ultimately to narrate the film because I wanted it to be clear, from an audience perspective from the get-go, that this was a daughter's perspective on their own family, and so it was coming from it's sort of more of an essay POV film as opposed to here's a quote unquote objective film about Ethel Kennedy. And I decided, instead of interviewing any experts, to just interview my siblings, and so that it would be, again, sort of going back to that idea of a documentary and preserving something that was, contained in and of itself. I hoped something meaningful to look back on, that it would sort of sustain itself over time and be, what it is, right, and not try to be something else. So I only interviewed my mother and my siblings in the making of the film, and it's an interesting process. In the opening of the film, I interview my mother and I say, okay, I ask her something, and the first thing that she says to me is, why do I have to answer all these questions? And I say, because I'm making a documentary about you. And she's like, this is a really bad idea. So that kind of, those are the first 3 lines of the film. And then I cut to my siblings, and they're all equally a pain in the neck. I'm like, can you look at me? And they're like, I can't look at you. And, and then I say to my brother Max, okay, so our mother had 11 children. And he says, no, she only had 10. And I said, no, she had 11. And then he counts, Catherine Joe Biden, Courtney, Michael, Carrie, Kurtz, Max, Douglas. And I'm like, and me. And, he's like, I always forget. So, that's kind of the tone of the film. And then it goes downhill from there. So, but they were all really difficult.
Yeah. I remember seeing, when I saw that film, I remember thinking, like, they've got to be doing that as some kind of shtick, just to stick it to you. But they really did.
That's their natural tendency. So that's my life.
Well, in 2014, Last Days in Vietnam was an extraordinary look at a messy and emotional moment in American history. I'm wondering if some of the people that you talked to for that documentary were a little reluctant to revisit that era and the decisions that were going on.
Well, the perspective I took from that film, I was asked to make that film by PBS to look at the last days in the war, and it's a fascinating film, which I showed Ethel here and Last Days in Vietnam at this festival, and they were both, and my Laird film.
And Laird, yeah, Take Every Wave.
Yeah, so, which have all been fantastic screenings, and which I've thoroughly enjoyed, so it's very nice to be back here. It's the 20th anniversary,
It is the 20th
right?
anniversary, yes.
So that's exciting. And so that film was interesting to me, because my initial response when I was asked to tell that story was, gosh, so much has been done on Vietnam, and what can I say that's new about those final days of the war? And so which is what I said to the executive, and I said, well, let me do some research and sort of figure if I can tell something different. And then I started researching it, and I was like, I didn't know this happened, and I didn't know this happened, and I was shocked by what I didn't know. Yeah. I mean, even that shot of the helicopter on top of the embassy, which is probably the most iconic image during those final days, it's not even on top of the embassy, right? So like the things I thought I knew, I didn't even know. Right. And one of the ways that we tell this story is to focus on the fact that, kind of giving a little context to the war itself and helping people understand that when Vietnam fell, that we had signed a peace agreement 2 years earlier, and at that point there were only 7,000 Americans in the country, and they were just keeping the peace, and so they were non-military. And so it fell much quicker than anybody imagined because the U.S. wasn't there to protect it, and there was no way we were going to go back into the war despite having committed to doing so. And that once they got to Saigon and we had 24 hours to get out, and then they made it clear that it was, all hell was going to break loose, that in Washington they decided to just get the Americans out. And the Americans on the ground knew that once they left, all of their Vietnamese counterparts would be killed or tortured or thrown in prison and treated horrendously, and they were very close to these people, and many of them, they were married to Vietnamese, they had children who were Vietnamese, and it was, it was a country that we had occupied or had been in and supported for many, many years, and so we were very close to them. And so our story really ends up focusing on the Americans who were there and the Vietnamese who, in those last 24 hours, risked their lives to save as many Vietnamese as possible. And there are these really harrowing and beautiful, inspiring stories that emerged in a war that I think, nobody knows for its American heroes, right? It's not really associated with that. And so that perspective on that war, and at the same time very much holding the U.S. accountable and I think showing what happens when we leave a war and what happens to the people who are left behind and what those stakes are. And as we were trying to get out of Afghanistan and Iraq at that time, and similar things were happening, particularly in Iraq, that we really think through the consequence and kind of the end game and the exit strategy when we're starting these endeavors a little bit more, because the stakes are so high. And again, with that film, we didn't interview any historians. It's 100% told from the perspective of the people who were at the embassy, who were on the ground. Or I also interviewed, Kissinger, and people who were creating the policies and the decisions they were making at the White House that, had the implications that they did.
Yeah. I love that style, by the way. It's almost like a Studs Terkel, like the Good War. It's like it's really listening to the voices of the people who were there as opposed to commentators kind of commenting on it. Tonight's closing film, Above and Beyond, NASA's Journey to Tomorrow, like last year's Take Every Wave, is a major part of the Sarasota Film Festival. Take us through this myriad and fascinating era of this film tonight, Rory, because it involves so many things. It involves the space program, but it also involves climate change, and it involves the leadership at the time, and it involves the country coming together in the 1960s in a very, very fascinating way, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's 2018 is the 60th anniversary of NASA, so the film is very much a celebration of the institution looking back over the last 60 years and helping to understand what contributions it's made to our understanding of who we are and where we are in the universe, and the knowledge that they have created for us to kind of have that context. And I think that, and it starts with really my Uncle Jack having the vision and giving that really extraordinary speech at Rice University, where he launches us to the moon, and within a decade's time, and commits us as a nation to get there, not because it's easy, but because it's hard, and without knowing what we're going to learn, but for the sake of knowledge. And there's something so beautiful about that speech and that moment and looking back at that time, and I think particularly in the context of where we are right now as a nation and how divided we are, where you see leadership that is not only bringing us together as a country, but bringing the best out of all of us, right? He's talking about doing something because it's difficult and because it is our nature to explore, and we don't even know what we're going to learn, right? And it's these ideals and these ideas that drive him and us and want us to be the best we can be as individuals. And I think there's something so beautiful about that idea and that notion that kind of drive NASA to where we are today. And over the course of that period of time where they've helped us understand, you know, our galaxy and you know, our universe and our solar system, and so many huge and important questions, and the technology they've had to help us look out into that space and create some context for us to understand that, but also in doing so, turning those instruments back on Earth. And now having this really profound understanding of this planet and how precious it is and how vulnerable it is and how important it is that we take care of it. And those scientists, you know, giving us those tools of knowledge that we then, as a human population, need to process and, you know, make smart choices on, right? So the stakes are different now than they were 60 years ago, but to me, they're actually more pressing and more relevant.
Absolutely, and the way you made the film for your Uncle Jack, is that right? I mean, kind of it's dedicated to him.
Well, I don't know that I would say I made it for him per se. I mean, I think I made it being inspired by him and wanting to remind us of, you know, what that vision was and what leadership can be and what it can look like and how it can, you know, bridge these divides. You know, I mean, I love this country and I love everybody in this country, and, you know, I want us to be looking at the 80% of the things that we agree with and not dwelling in the 20% that make everybody hate each other, right? I mean, that's not who we are. And that's not where we need to be simmering, right? I mean, there's a lot more that we have in common than we have that divides us. But you need leadership sometimes to pull that part out, and I think that's, you know, on both sides is what we're lacking. Yeah,
and just the brief quote that you gave of that speech sends goose pimples down my spine. It's just such an extraordinary moment. We have time for about 2 or 3 quick questions if anybody has one. Yes, sir.
Well, thanks for being a friend of the film festival, coming back and showing up the film, and your work, your body of work is extraordinary. Most of it's inaccessible to see if you haven't seen the old films. Have you ever thought about possibly making a site, letting people stream those, buy them? Will HBO let people do that?
Thank you. I mean, you can get a lot of them through HBO Go. So I would look there for them. And I mean, the issue is for me is I don't own most of my films, right? So they were commissioned. And so the entity who paid for them owns them. So it's not, I mean, I might be able to actually have a link that takes you back to those sites, which we should probably do. I appreciate your interest in it. And I should look into that a little bit more. But if you Google most of them, I think that most of them you'll be able to find. And you know, HBO Go has a lot of them.
Yes.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Can I just take you back to the Appalachians in Uganda for a minute and acknowledging the struggles faced by poverty and AIDS. Separate from that, could you talk about a little bit about the social structure and especially the happiness quotient on a scale of 1 to 10, apart from the AIDS and the poverty?
You mean like, are the people in Appalachia happy?
Right.
I would say they were. I would say they were. I mean, listen, there were I mean, happiness is a very hard thing to calculate, and it's fleeting, and it comes and goes in every human, even within seconds, right? So it's sort of a concept that's hard to capture entirely. But I think that one of the things that was striking to me about the family was that they did live in poverty and pretty extreme poverty, but Irie Bowling was certainly the grandmother, the matriarch of the family, was really a source of happiness and inspiration, and she had a fantastic outlook in life. I think they had, a good spiritual foundation. And they had, their basic needs were being met. I mean, there weren't people who were going hungry there. They didn't have like distended stomachs. It wasn't to that degree of poverty. But at the same time, there was real struggles, and there was a lot of, there was substance abuse, and there was certainly physical abuse towards women and sexual abuse. And so that, played itself out for certain of the female population there. So, I can't say all of them were particularly happy. And I think in a family there was, there's mental illness. There's a whole range of things that go on in a big family. I mean, I have 10 siblings. We have a whole range in our family too, right? And so I think that it is, there's a human struggle there. I think the AIDS epidemic, I think it's on a different side of the spectrum. I mean, there was a misery factor there that was pretty extreme and sad, and where the hardship was pretty extreme, in my opinion.
We have time for just one more. Yes, ma'am. Right there. You put your hand up first.
In making your film about NASA, did you pick up on any feelings of people there, of how they feel about the deregulation of our environment right now, the rules to protect our environment, and also how do you feel about the colonization of Mars?
Ooh. Well, first of all, I would encourage you all to come to the screening tonight, because there's a really fantastic woman who is speaking at the panel discussion following the screening. It would be a brief panel discussion, like 15 minutes, because I'm sure you're sick of hearing from me. But she'll be on the panel, and I'm going to try to let her answer all the questions, because she's fantastic. And she was the chief scientist at NASA. And so, and she loves talking about Mars, and she's incredibly knowledgeable. I would say that, so one of the things that a lot of people don't know, although some of you may understand, is that NASA is responsible for most of the information that we know about what's going on in the climate of this world and our country and around the globe. So they are the source material for most of the information that is associated with climate change. They are the source of that, and they are scientists who have been studying this, and they are on the spectrum of Republicans, Democrats, conservatives. They're all over the place. And I would say 100% of the scientists who work on this issue absolutely, at NASA, absolutely know that the issues that we are dealing with today around weather and extreme weather is the result of climate change, that is the result of carbon, that is the result of what we as a people are releasing in this world. So they are definitive about that. And they are concerned, I would say. I mean, they keep their politics out because they are a non-political institution, but they are enormously concerned. And one of the scientists who, was just an extraordinary person who I interviewed was this guy named Pierce, who he's a scientist. He's done spacewalks. He's gone up to the International Space Station. He is a voice of authority. He was diagnosed about a year and a half ago with cancer, and he was told he has a year to live. And he then went home and he told his family and he got his papers in order. And after about a week, he sat down and he thought, okay, how am I going to spend the next year of my life? And he then wrote an article in, I don't know if it was the New York Times or the Washington Post, saying, you know, after careful reflection, I decided I'm going to go back to work on Monday because the work I'm doing around climate change is the most important work, and we are on a train that is on a train wreck. And all I can do is spend my final days trying to help people understand that. And whatever your politics are, wherever you stand on anything, this is the science, and this is where we are, and this is where we're heading, and we can change it, but we have to make changes. So I'm not saying he reflects everybody at NASA, but you know, those are the facts.
Wow. And you had a question about colonization of Mars. We're going to just kind of briefly.
I'm
yes.
sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
So
It's a fun idea to kind of riff on for a second.
You know, I think colonization is a big word. I think I think it's interesting to get to Mars. I think it's doable. I think we need the political will to commit to that. And I think there is a lot that we can learn. We talk about it in the film, and I think in watching it, hopefully you'll have a better understanding of kind of what it will take to get there and what the implications are of being there and then having to get back. Because so far, you know, besides us going to the moon whenever we've gone to different planets, we haven't come back. So we're pretty good at like getting the Mars rover onto Mars, which is an extraordinary feat. But we haven't really figured out like how to get those things off and to take samples from these planets and bring them back to us. So, you know, that's its own challenge that is complicated, and there's complicated challenges related to it. But, you know, I think it's interesting. So I'm for it in theory. I mean, I think that it's, you know, to me, a sort of a question of resources. I certainly am not for it if it means that we're going to sacrifice the work that, you know, NASA is doing in this world, right? So that's a priority. I think that's, to me, should remain a priority for NASA as well.
I cannot wait to see the film. It is tonight's closing film, Above and Beyond, NASA's Journey to Tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, acclaimed documentary filmmaker and friend of the Sarasota Film Festival, Rory Kennedy.
Thank you all. Appreciate.
Thanks, Rory.